When my phone lit up with his name, I froze. Grandpa, on a cracked black screen, seemed too small a word for the man who had steered me from scraped knees to nervous interviews with the same steady, gray-gloved hands. I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. Instead, I tapped accept, and the world condensed to the wheeze of his breath and the little room behind it. His kitchen, where light always filtered low and golden. "You there, pumpkin," he said. He always called me that, a relic of a childhood he kept alive in every pocket of his speech. I swallowed. "Yeah. You okay?" A bedside silence hummed. He cleared it like a man who had been rehearsing a sentence and decided, at the last second, to change it. "Do you like the house I bought you?" The words landed like a dropped cup of water. The spillless sort, except the ripples moved through my chest. I laughed once, disbelieving. "What house?" "You'll see," he said. Then he coughed and the line went soft. He signed off with a small shrug of an old man's privacy. He would tell me later. The rest of the afternoon became a film strip of my life split down the center. On one track, the bills, the alarmed emails from my landlord, the hollow dullness of the apartment that seemed to swallow light like a bad mood. On the other, my grandpa's slow, consistent love. When I was 8, he taught me how to change a tire. When I was 19, he sat with me through an interview and told me I was respectably composed. He'd paid for my first laptop after my parents were gone. He'd built a birdhouse that lasted 20 summers. Still a house. The sentence wouldn't stick. I dismissed the call as something grand gestures do for old men. A hopeful private theater. But the next morning there was an email in bold from a realtor I'd never heard of. Then another with photographs. On my lunch break I opened them and the air around me seemed to tilt. A porch, wide enough for 3 rocking chairs. A maple tree that must have been ancient. Its roots like knuckles under the lawn. Inside, sunlight warm and honeyed, spilled into rooms that smelled faintly of lemon oil and wood glue. The kitchen looked like something from a movie. White cabinets with brass handles, a butcher block island, a window seat that seemed to have been made for thinking. The bedroom had a narrow beam of light that struck the quilt in a way that made it look like a stage. Each image clicked together like chapters one hadn't read but always wanted. I scrolled to the bottom of the email and there it was. An address. A neighborhood I recognized in a nostalgic way. A place where the baker still knew your name. Where porches were for conversations and the mailman seemed glad to be human. My hands shook as I called him back. "Grandpa," I said. "Did you?" There was silence on the other end for a while. And then the old man chuckled, the sound brittle and bright. "Thought you might like a change of scenery," he said. "Listen, I'm coming today. You're gonna get yourself over here. We'll have some tea and I'll show you." I wanted to refuse. I wanted to say no, I'm grown, I'll manage, I don't need. But the corner of my mouth eased into the same shape it had when I was 6 and he promised a secret. "Okay," I said. "I'll come." That afternoon the drive felt impossibly long. Trees leaned over the road like cathedral ribs, and all along I rehearsed versions of how I would react. Stunned gratitude, careful politeness, the tearful embrace everyone on those feel-good shows would like to see. I parked 2 houses down and walked across a lawn that smelled of wet grass. When I reached the porch, the front door was already open. He stood inside, smaller than I remembered, but with shoulders that still carried the habit of carrying things. Groceries, my troubles, the sort of steady that anchored a life. The house wrapped around him like a coat. "Come in," he said simply. The first thing I noticed in the hallway was a photograph on the wall. My mother in her 20s, laughing at something off frame. Grandpa's hand rested against the frame like it held a pulse. "How did you?" I started. He waved his good hand and shuffled toward the kitchen, where sunlight fell across a table set for 2. 2 mugs steamed, and a small jar of sugar sat between them like an anchor. "You used to like the house my sister had," he said. "You always said the kitchen would be enough." "Your sister?" I hadn't known. He smiled, something private curving his mouth. "A long story. But that house, it had a kitchen. It was where she baked bread and kept the radio on. I thought you might like one like that." My heart tumbled forward then. "Grandpa, you bought this? For me? For us, he corrected. For you. For me. For the rest of the things you'll need a porch for. There was a softness in the way he said it that made my eyes sting. I'd imagined him spending his savings on smaller, careful things. A new pair of shoes, a prescription paid in full, a check tucked into a birthday card. A house felt like something else. A mural of unapologetic generosity painted with his last, careful strokes. We drank tea and talked about nothing and everything. He told me about a neighbor who had a sour patch of lawn and a cat that owned the neighborhood. He showed me the basement, its bare rafters buzzing with possibility. A corner for painting, a shelf for tools, a place for my mother's records stacked in a careful haphazard. You always loved music, he said. I kept her collection. The attic held little reliquaries of a life. A battered accordion, a stack of postcards tied with twine, a yellowed map folded at the corner of Kansas. I found a box labeled in his careful, wavering handwriting. For when you're ready. Inside were letters. My mother's handwriting, my name inked at the top of a page. A photograph of me as a child with spaghetti for hair and a glue gun on my lap. Her note read like a compass. Small, generous truths about who I was, how to mend a button, a recipe for stew. My breath caught on the page, and I understood that the house was also a conversation across absent years. Grandpa had created a place where ghosts would be comfortable, where grief would not be dismissed but allowed to make itself a shape. Over the next few weeks, the house revealed itself like a novel you keep opening. Mail arrived for me, and I began to haunt the kitchen like a tenant in training. I learned where the light lasted the longest across the living room floor, and where the coffee table caught the sun. I planted herbs in a small pot outside the back door, and he taught me how to prune. The town welcomed us with an odd mixture of curiosity and ritual kindness. The postman tipped his cap. The baker slid a loaf into my hand and said, "Welcome home." On Sunday mornings, the neighbors came by and left casseroles, like armored gestures against solitude. For the first time in years, I found myself lingering over breakfast, savoring silence that wasn't emptiness. But the house was not only kindness. It was a mirror, a place that reflected choices and the scaffolding of my life. The rent checks my landlord had been sending were still a memory of another life. The house forced me to reconcile the way I had tiptoed through years, pausing at dreams and saying, "Later." One evening, as dusk filtered through the living room, Grandpa settled into the wingback chair with a book he never finished. Outside, the maple whispered its leaves like pages. I sat on the floor with my back to the couch, the space between us folded with something like reverence. "You could say no," I said. He blinked. "To what?" "To all this. To you spending." My throat closed around the word money. "You could have used the savings." He set the book aside and looked at me as if he'd been waiting for the question to be named. "I had savings," he said. "And then I thought, tomorrow is full of promises people forget. You'd promised yourself a life and then kept putting it off. I didn't want to make promises I wouldn't keep. So I bought a thing that couldn't be erased by rent hikes." He leaned forward, the movement a tiny war against his bones. "You remember the night your mother left? You were 6. You hid under my coat when the thunder came. And I told you a story about a lighthouse. I told you that when the world feels waterlogged, there is a place that will stand. I meant it. I felt the outline of that night like map lines. The lighthouse story had been a salve. You paid for it yourself." "Yes." "Sold a few bonds, dug into the biscuit tin, sold my old watch." He held up a limp hand as if slapping each cost flat. "Look, I'm not made of money. I'm made of stubborn and regret. But I wanted you to have something that was yours. Something that smelled like lemon oil." We laughed then, soft and conspiratorial. The house had always had a smell, lemon and sawdust, and a faint ghost of baking. It smelled like all the small, careful things Grandpa had given me without naming them. Days turned into domesticities. Fixing a leaky tap, finding a handyman who charged us in jokes and coffee, deciding how to hang the photograph of my mother. I learned the rhythms of the town. The library's book club that met every Thursday. The Sunday market where a man sold honey so golden you wanted to drink it raw. And with small domestic acts came unspooling stories. One afternoon in the garden, while plucking a weed, I pried back the soil and found a small tin. Inside, a set of letters tied with faded ribbon. They were addressed to my grandpa, decades older, written in an indecipherable slant and stamped in a language I didn't know. He laughed when he saw them. "Letters from a woman in another city," he said. A running of words that never became more than ink. She sent me news of trains and of the night they burned the old theater. I wrote back once, and then life took us like it takes everything. "Did you ever?" I started. "No," his face closed and then opened like curtains that guarded a stage. "Not for that." I learned in piecemeal that my grandpa had a more complicated ledger than his gentle chair might suggest. He'd loved and lost, saved and given, collected regrets the way other people collected books. The house, I realized, was less a rescue than a gesture of repair. It was an attempt to stitch a life that had been frayed. One night, months after the house had stopped feeling like a stranger and become a skin, I found an envelope sunk between the cushions of the guest chair. My name on the front, in my mother's handwriting again, and inside a single page. It was a will of sorts, but not legal paper. It was a list, not of property, but of things. "For the quiet mornings," she'd written. "Keep the mug with the tiny chip." "For the terrible phone calls," she'd written. "Play the record with the saxophone." Each line was a breadcrumb for living. I read it until the ink smudged with my tears. "Why would she?" I asked Grandpa when I found him, flustered and small in the kitchen. "Because she knew you," he said. "She knew you would need instructions. She always liked to leave a map." That was the house's second secret. It did not ask to be loved. It asked to be inhabited. The boxes, the letters, the recipes were a library of how to be human. And then one winter night the test came. A pipe burst in the basement at 2 in the morning. I woke to the sound like a small war and found water fanning across the cement like a pale tide. I called the plumber, who answered like a sleepy superhero. Grandpa put his coat on and sat on the bottom step, head bowed. I felt the weight of the house in those hours. A physical thing, heavy and stubborn. We stood in the kitchen as the water drained, and the plumber left with a promise to come back the next day. "You okay?" "Yes." He looked up at the ceiling as if it were an old friend. "I'm thinking about the time we—" He stopped short, a story not meant for everyone. "It's good to be here," he said simply. "There's a peculiar geometry to love in middle age. It is simultaneously fragile and adamant. My grandpa had, in buying the house, made a statement that love can be formatted into rooms. Not a love that makes you indebted, but a love that asks only to be used. To burn toast on the stove, to curse softly when screws strip, to invite neighbors for tea." The town started to notice. People saw the two of us on the porch and remarked on the way he carried his cane like a note in a song. He started teaching a woodshop class for kids at the community center. I painted the old kitchen chairs in a color that made him shake his head and grin. We hosted a dinner where the neighbors crowded the table until it groaned. For the first time in a long time, we had a network of people who knew the contours of our days. Then, the day the bank needed signatures, the world folded in a different way. Paperwork became a litmus test. I sat across from a woman with a sharp bob and a stapler who peered at us like we were already a story. My hands were nervous. Grandpa held them like a punishing, kindly anchor. "You know what's mine," he said later, in that private voice that belonged to the porch in the hours just before dusk. He told me about selling his watch. He told me he'd pawned something small when he was younger and then bought it back because it meant the world to him. "I did it for you," he said, "because you kept saying, 'later.' I wanted to make a later that arrived." Sometimes I think the house was only a way to show me he was running out of laters. The phrase echoed like a bell. You could spend your life promising yourself, but you could also spend it doing small warlike acts of generosity that pocked the map of your future. We had arguments, of course. I nagged about money. He nagged me about leaving the porch light on. We swore and made up with the kind of clumsy tenderness only family cultivates. Once, we screamed so loudly that the neighbors knocked on the wall. Then we made it up by baking a cake that burned at the edges and calling it rustic. Years passed and the house grew the way a good story shapes a person. Gradually, with seasons as editors. My job changed. I met someone and then didn't. I learned that an empty kitchen can be a cathedral and also a confession booth. I grew into the house's corners like a person into a new language. Taught me how to be gentle with things and with myself. The first time I heard Grandpa on the phone, voice trembly with a tremor I'd never heard before, I felt at once wholly terrified and curiously prepared. He had a tiny stroke, the sort that rearranges sentences but not entire people. We adjusted routines. I moved his chair closer to the window so he could watch the light change without needing to go outside. One afternoon, as the maple shed the last of its leaves, he looked at me with a softness I could barely name. "Do you like the house I bought you?" he asked, the question returning like a refrain. I walked the rooms, touched the banister, traced the faded outline of where the piano had been, and I realized the question had been a test of something larger than gratitude. It was an invitation to accept that love comes in complicated currency. In houses, in hours, in the willingness to risk what little you have. "I do," I said finally. He smiled in the way old men smile when they're holding a secret, and the secret is simply that they are content. "Good," he said. "Then take care of her. Take care of her." He had feminized the house, as if it were a person with moods and needs and the small stubborn pride of an engine that will run if you feed it oil and respect. Promise. Years later, when his hands stopped answering and the breath left his chair at last, I sat on the porch with a cup that had a tiny chip. I read his letters and my mother's and the old woman's notes from another city. The town brought casseroles and songs and their memory of him. A man who fixed more than loose screws, who mended wrongs with small stitches. When the funeral was over, a neighbor tapped my shoulder and said, "He left the house to you?" "Yes," I said. "Seems right," she said. I went back inside and the house greeted me like a living thing. It was the same porch breeze, the same thread of dust in the sunlight. But it felt different, less like a gift and more like a responsibility. I thought of his question one last time. "Do you like the house I bought you?" I moved through rooms like a paying homage. In the kitchen, I found a shelf with a jar of lemon oil and a note in his hand. "Keep it bright." The handwriting trembled in places where his fingers had not been steady. I laughed, in spite of the hollow. Yes, I liked it. Liked it enough to stay. Liked it enough to fix what broke. Liked it enough to make new small promises. To water the basil even when I was tired, to answer the phone when the storm came, to read the letters at midnight when the house felt particularly like silence. In the end, Grandpa's question was larger than a check or a deed. It was a plea for me to accept a life, with its unglamorous chores, its smells, its brittle human edges, and to answer with the kind of devotion that keeps roofs from sagging and hearts from shrinking. "Do you like the house I bought you?" he had asked. "Yes," I said into the empty room, to the photograph on the mantel, to the echo of his voice in the stairwell. "I do." The house listened and kept the answer, as houses do. It kept it in the warmth of the kitchen and the squeak of the third stair. It kept it in the jar of lemon oil and the map folded in the attic. It kept the sound of my grandpa's laugh, the way he said my name, and the peculiar stubborn hope that love can be a place, something you can walk into with shoes off and stay a while. And sometimes late at night, I swear the house remembers him too. It hums with the same steadiness, as if the walls themselves were made from his patience. I press my palms on the banister and feel the years like rings in a tree. I feel small and enormous at once. "Do you like the house I bought you?" The question keeps arriving like a bell, not to be answered once but to be lived into. Every time I sweep the floor, every time I bake a cake that burns at the edges, every time I pick sage from the pot on the sill, I am answering him. I like it. I love it. I will keep it bright. And in that keeping, the man who taught me to change a tire and told me about lighthouses keeps teaching me, even after he's gone, that a home is not only a place to sleep, but a ledger of all the small mercies that hold you up.